Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our panel, Beyond the Barrels, Communicating Pipeline Data to Empower Stakeholders. My name is Erin Sutherland, and I am the Policy and Program Director / Counsel at the Trust. I'll be your moderator today. I'm joined today by James Eager, of the Pipeline Safety Trust. I've got Meg O'Connor of PHMSA, and Alexandra Shaykevich from the Environmental Integrity Project. We're going to begin this with 3 presentations from each of our panelists, and then at the end we'll go into questions from me to the panelists, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session. And today, who would like to begin? James?
Yeah, it's all over. Cool. Thank you, Erin. Thank you all for coming. I know it's right after lunch. We're all feeling a little sleepy, potentially. But yeah, really, well, I want to start by saying, it was great to organize this panel. I want to thank, Alexandra and Meg for participating, Erin for moderating. And we really want to, focus on some ongoing projects where we're communicating different types of pipeline data to help, equip some of those stakeholders that, we've all heard so much about today. We want to make sure that they have the knowledge and tools they need to make informed decisions, to participate effectively, and just maintain a well-educated, well-informed group of folks who are motivated to work in pipeline safety. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at the Trust to accomplish those goals. I'll lead with our mission and how data fits in to PST's mission. We'll move into sort of our data program and the work that we're doing, who we're intending to reach, a couple of specific projects that we're working on, and our intended outcomes from those projects. So some of you will be familiar with our mission, and I bolded, things that to me is, this is where I fit into that as the data manager at the Trust, is the education, it's the increased access to information, and it's the partnerships with residents, with safety advocates, government, and industry, who are everybody's well represented at this conference, and, I want to maintain, those really strong partnerships, good relationships with folks from PHMSA, from partner organizations, and from the community that really seem to be motivated by learning more about pipelines. So what are we working on with regard to that? A lot of what I do is, some contextualizing work, looking at industry and regulator claims, assessing whether there's been progress or lack of progress, regress even, looking at emerging trends, what's been happening in the past few years, and how we might respond to that. Working a lot in increased access. PHMSA has a lot of great stuff online that's accessible, but sometimes just lowering some of the barriers to specific pieces of information is what we're looking to do at the Trust, things that our partner organizations are interested in, that the public is interested in. And then working on different relationships with data, what third-party sources are compelling, what supports broader narratives in the data, and sort of our goals at the Trust. And who are we doing this all for? I mentioned those stakeholders. You've been hearing them so far all day. You're going to hear them throughout the conference. Industry, where are operators falling short potentially? Government, how can we help support data-driven regulations as we get into different types of rulemaking, different types of regulations that folks are working on, like Erin? And the public, how can we inform the public responsibly and effectively so that they can respond to issues in their communities? And so that they can prepare for potential issues in their communities. So a couple projects that we've been working on this year is like this state incident map. PHMSA's done some great work on some state incident maps, but we've been looking a lot at what other variables we can bring in that folks might be interested in, and trying to present it on a very where's my house sort of level. Folks hear about incident maps and incident data, and I think one of the questions that I get first is, where are they happening? And I think it's motivated by are they happening close to me kind of perspective. And that's, how we want to make sure that we're presenting everything. and adding some of those social, built, and natural environment contexts. That's what I talked about with the relational data, looking at things like conserved lands, looking at things like tribal lands, different demographics, bringing in some of those environmental justice perspectives to make sure that we're, centering communities that have been disproportionately affected by some of these incidents. Another project that we've been working on quite a lot is this annual incident review, and that's something that we intend to start doing every year. And I mean, the name pretty much says exactly what it is. How does this year compare with last year, with the last 5 years, the last 10 years? And it's an opportunity to talk about some of what I was saying earlier as far as emerging trends, historical trends, context, and again, giving folks a chance to look at where is my house, where are the people that where's my community, how are pipeline incidents affecting my community directly or indirectly. And that second one is really, the annual incident review is really about telling a story, talking about the narrative, threads through the data. The little GIF just shows you that it's like, a little scrollable thing, which, is part of trying to not just present data as data, not just, a static graph on a page, but giving people the opportunity to walk through a story of the past year in pipeline incidents, and giving them a chance to really interact with the data in a way that I think lowers some of those barriers that folks feel when they go to PHMSA's website sometimes. Again, it's great that that data is open and accessible to the public, but it's all about lowering barriers for some members of the public, for sure. And really, what the whole purpose of this panel is, what the whole purpose of this session is how we're then empowering stakeholders. This graph on your left, is from our state transparency review that we also do annually. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this graph, but all of this is with the intent of getting better engagement from all of our stakeholders, not just the folks that have historically been connected, but also the folks that, we may not hear from as much because maybe they don't feel as well informed, they don't feel as well supported by the resources that they have access to. This is all about improving accessibility of timely and responsive analyses. It's about addressing those emerging concerns, and it's about remaining responsible and considerate of industry and government best practices. Like I said earlier in the talk, I don't want to do anything in a vacuum. I want to make sure that anything that I'm working on still fits into the broader data culture that industry and government historically has been centered in, but I want to make sure that what we're doing here at the Trust starts to center the public a little more, and that we're remaining responsible to the public, informing them accurately, effectively, and in a very timely manner as much as we can, certainly. And we wouldn't be able to do that with those partnerships, certainly without PHMSA making all their data publicly accessible, since that is, my main source. But yeah, I just want to make sure that anything that we're doing at the Trust is empowering everybody that takes in our data. I know that some folks in the industry, some folks in government have had feedback from me, and I take that all well into account, but ultimately I feel like if I'm thinking about who my client is, who my end user is, when I'm working on things at the Trust, it is the public at the end of the day. They are the folks who are most interested and most informed by what I'm doing. And with that, I'll wrap it up. So thank you all for your time, and I think I'll pass it on to Meg. You don't have to clap, but thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Meg O'Connor, and I'm a data analyst with PHMSA's Accident Investigation Division. We're a group that deploys nationally to federally regulated pipeline accident sites to do investigations and look into the root cause. And I don't travel to those investigation sites. I take the information, and I live about 40 minutes from here in Slidell, Louisiana. I'm a remote employee, and so I get all the information and I crunch it from there. And if you have any questions for me after this talk. You can recognize me limping around in my cast boot. When I told my colleagues that I was going to be speaking here today, they told me to break a leg. And as a data analyst, I can be a little too literal, and I did a really good job with that advice. Oh, sorry about rocky start here, but. So I'm pretty new to PHMSA and pretty new to the pipeline world in general, but I chose to take on this role, and I'm really excited to be in this role, partially because I really believe in PHMSA's commitment to data, and I really feel like as a data analyst with this organization, I have the potential to affect change because PHMSA has committed itself to being a data-driven agency. And some of that's exemplified by the fact that PHMSA makes so much of its data available to the public. You can find it at this link here. We are constantly working on improving how we give our data to the public. And I think there are a lot of different ways that we're working on this. But if you would like to access any of the data, and especially if you have any questions about how to access this data, please pull me aside at any point. I don't have time to cover it in this talk, but I would love to help you learn to use this data, and I hope in the future you'll see many more options for how to access our data in analytics. And in addition to making our data transparent and accessible, PHMSA also has a strong commitment to modernizing and using as many cutting-edge techniques as we can. So I think we're really starting, as an organization, we're really pulling in more rigorous statistics and more modern and cutting-edge methods as they become available. I think data science is a field that's constantly changing every day, and it can be difficult to keep up with all the new tools and techniques that are available to us, but it's certainly a goal of ours. And one example of this is we have an interdepartment team called the Data Analytics team. And together as a group, we're looking at old data and new data, sort of with a new, fresh set of eyes, and we're really trying to pull it together in a holistic picture. And as I said, I work for the Accident Investigation Division, and because of the data set we're predominantly using, which concerns how, when, where, and why accidents occurred, it would be really easy for us as a group to be predominantly reactive or retroactive in looking at this data. But we feel that it's really important to not just respond to bad things that happen, but we think that the power of historical data is in how it can help us get ahead of the curve moving forward. And so even though it's a very historical data set, we're attempting to use this to move from a reactive place to a predictive or proactive place. And so as a fairly new PHMSA data analyst, I've been thinking a lot about, well, how can we do this? How can we take historical data and make it mean something that empowers both us and the end user, our stakeholders, to actually make different decisions that might prevent catastrophe before it happens? So in our data set, we already often look at the cause type, which after an accident occurs, the operator, and sometimes PHMSA, identifies the cause of that accident. And this can be thought of as the last domino that falls that causes that rupture or that leak. And that's really helpful in a lot of ways. You can see examples in the bottom circle there of some of our different cause types. That's really helpful because in order to start predicting when and where things might happen, we really need to understand cause and effect. But I really think we also need to take it one step further. If we don't have any lead time, we're not going to be able to prevent the catastrophe before it happens. So we need to buy ourselves, and as a community, we need to attempt to identify the problem as early in the timeline as possible. And so instead of that last domino being the point we realize something bad is happening, what's the first domino that we can recognize? And so the Accident Investigation Division also identifies a risk factor for each of our accidents. And this can be thought of as like a vulnerability category. It's sort of the answer to the question, what might we have seen or what might the operator or the stakeholder have seen earlier that could have prevented the ultimate cause? So the key question here, in my opinion, is how can AID use this risk factor data to better communicate with our stakeholders and ultimately empower the community to prevent and predict accidents? And so I'm going to just give an example. I'm a data analyst, so I'm mostly comfortable showing you all data. So I'm going to show you some data. And I'm going to show you how I like to visualize and look at some of these concepts. So don't panic. This isn't as complicated as it looks. This is called a Sankey or a flow diagram, and it's one of my favorite types of graphs, probably to the chagrin of everyone I work with because they have to see them roughly 4 times a week. And what this is showing, on the right hand, this is, by the way, gas transmission data is the data set I'm visualizing here. But the cool thing about these flow graphs is we can change the nodes, meaning, sorry, I'm gonna limp over to where my short stature can attempt to gesture. These are nodes, and we can switch out the nodes to be any category of data we want to. So here I'm visualizing a binary yes or no. Was the gas that was released in that incident, greater than the median? Yes or no? But I could change that out to be, were there fatalities? Yes or no? I could change it out to be barrels of gas released. I could change cost. And likewise, any category of data that we want to visualize how it relates to another category, we can show here. And I think that's really cool because there's actually some really cool statistics happening under the hood here that I'm not sure I'd be always clever enough to grasp right away if I weren't seeing it visually. And this also empowers our stakeholders to get a really intuitive sense of how everything relates to other things. So for instance, in this diagram, in the center here, we have the risk factors, which again, you can think of as an early domino. And it flows in both directions. It flows towards yes or no, was it a greater than average release? And it flows this direction to the cause type. So let's imagine the risk factor weren't here for a second, and we were just looking at how the cause type related to the release amount. And we followed this yes all the way back to see that equipment failure is a big problem. That's great to know, but it's not necessarily the most empowering fact to tell someone, hey, don't let your equipment fail. That can leave us sort of floundering. By adding in the risk factor, we're really giving ourselves more information and lead time. So let's look at what equipment failure is flowing into. What risk factor caused those incidents by and large? Mostly preventative maintenance. You can see that the thickness of that ribbon is the greatest thickness, and therefore those have the greatest relationship, the greatest percentage flowing from equipment failure to preventative maintenance. And then most of the preventative maintenance issues have a greater than average release. And so by working backwards, another example here is over 50% of incidents where design was implicated as the risk factor flow into the yes, greater than average category. So this becomes a tool where by connecting data types, we really empower ourselves to attempt to get ahead of the curve. This is just one example of how new and innovative data visualizations and techniques, meaning new for this data set and this relationship, not necessarily new like I invented it, but this is an example of how we can take old data and by connecting it in new ways and looking at it from new perspectives, we can start to learn different things and hopefully move from a more reactive to a more proactive or predictive place as a community. And so in conclusion, in order to move towards our community goal of 0 pipeline accidents, we need to really understand the cause and the effect in each of these accidents and in the trends. And then we also need to identify the problem as early in the timeline as possible and understand how those early indicators relate to later catastrophic findings. the Accident Investigation Division's assignment of risk factors is one of our first steps to employing this type of technique. And we can use this information to empower our stakeholders and our partners to take that information and make it truly actionable. Instead of seeing something a second before catastrophe strikes, we hope to empower folks with data so that they can make decisions that might reverse and change the trends that we've seen in the past. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you to the Pipeline Safety Trust for organizing this conference and allowing this opportunity to speak. My name is Alexandra, and I'm with the Environmental Integrity Project. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan watchdog organization that advocates for the effective enforcement of environmental laws. And my work at EIP primarily involves managing the Oil and Gas Watch data set, which I will be speaking about today. Oil and Gas Watch is a public data set that tracks the build-out of oil, gas, and petrochemical infrastructure across the United States. We at EIP began collecting this data back in 2019 in order to spotlight the build-out of mid and downstream infrastructure that was taking place after the shale revolution. And we do that by tracking the construction or operating status of new and expanding facilities and pipelines that have been proposed since 2012. As a part of that, we also tally up each facility's potential to emit greenhouse gases and criteria air pollutants like particulate matter, and we also track wetland impacts and water body crossings for new and expanding pipelines. All of that information we gather from government approvals and permit documents, and we make all of that information available on our website as well as the local demographics of populations living within 3 miles of each facility, which we obtained from the EPA. Our aim is to be a valuable resource for community members, activists, environmental attorneys, other NGOs, academic researchers, and journalists. We aim to inform the public about new and expanding facilities and pipelines in order to empower frontline communities and increase public participation in the permitting process. We also aim to make actionable information like open comment opportunities and primary source documents easily accessible to a general audience in order to identify opportunities to strengthen permits and environmental protections. Finally, our Oil and Gas Watch news site, which is pictured here, aims to bring the data to life through investigative journalism and spotlight facilities and permits that are open for public comment in a weekly newsletter. So the website is comprised of 2 core data sets, one that tracks stationary sources and the other one that tracks pipelines. For this presentation, I will be focusing on our pipelines work, but I do think it's important to pause and just talk a little bit about scope. The industry is always changing, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of everything that we're tracking on the website. But it's important to note that we do not track everything on Oil and Gas Watch. So we do not track certain upstream sources like well pads or gathering pipelines. And because our website aims to spotlight new and proposed projects that have not yet been built, we do not track every existing facility and pipeline that is currently operating in the United States. In terms of our pipeline data, what we do track are crude and liquid pipelines, including pipelines that transport petrochemical products like Y-grade or mixed hydrocarbon gas liquids, as well as isolated petrochemical feedstocks like ethane or propane. We also track inter- and intrastate natural gas pipelines and increasingly more and more hydrogen and carbon pipelines. Currently, we're tracking over 250 pipeline projects, representing about 28,000 miles of new pipe. About half of those have not yet been fully constructed, but have the potential to impact about 19,000 acres of wetlands. Our website also provides information on digitized pipeline routes, like the Mountain Valley pipeline that's pictured here. And that data allows you to visualize connections between associated facilities and pipelines. And what we mean when we talk about an associated facility on Oil and Gas Watch is a facility or a pipeline that's being proposed or expanded as part of a pipeline project. That can include something like a compressor station that helps move gas through a pipeline and regulate flow and pressure, but it can also include an export terminal like an LNG or a crude oil export terminal, storage facilities, and in the case of carbon pipelines, injection and disposal wells. We also provide access to thousands of government records that we've obtained through government websites or public information requests. And all of this data can be exported through our website. You can export our pipelines data set in a CSV or an Excel format, or in the case of the pipeline routes, the geospatial data and underlying metadata. This is what a typical pipeline page looks like on Oil and Gas Watch. This is actually for the Mountain Valley Pipeline that you just saw in the previous slide. So as I mentioned earlier, we do track wetland impacts as well as water body crossings. For gas pipelines, we also track greenhouse gas emissions from additional compression. What we noticed when we started collecting this pipeline data is that information on environmental impacts is also often presented in piecemeal. And so what our website aims to do is aggregate that data in order to present a more complete and accurate picture of environmental impacts. All of that information we obtain from permit documents. However, it is important to note that data availability greatly differs depending on the type of pipeline or the product type, what the pipeline's actually carrying. The most robust data that we have comes from environmental impact statements and environmental assessments that FERC or MARAD conduct as a part of their NEPA review. For liquids pipelines and basically all of the other product types that we're tracking, data can be really sparse. So if a company is not required to obtain a permit under one of the statutes listed here, oftentimes we do have to rely on industry sources and company-provided data, which often lacks information on environmental impacts. There are a few government data sets that can be useful. The EIA publishes a pipelines data set that's updated quarterly, I believe. And for existing carbon pipelines, PHMSA has a pretty good list. Unfortunately, that is the extent of the PHMSA data that we rely on. While PHMSA does publish, allow you to view pipeline routes, they do not allow you to export that data. And that information is only available on a county-by-county level. The agency argues that that's because of national security risks, and providing more granular spatial data for pipelines would pose a risk to national security. I would argue that that information is in the public interest, and we would love to see that policy change. Excuse me. In terms of the pipeline routes and the data that we collect there, there are a few government data sets that we rely on, but overwhelmingly, all of our pipeline routes are digitized by hand from PDF or paper maps. Whenever we can, we obtain that information from permit documents, but again, if a company is not required to obtain a permit under one of these statutes, we have to rely on company-provided data, and oftentimes it's at a pretty coarse spatial resolution. So our pipelines data set, the resolution across our pipelines data set can greatly vary. What you see here is a screenshot of the attribute table that you can obtain from our website when you export our pipelines data. And as you can see here, the spatial resolution can greatly vary by the product type as well as the source of the data. But we try to be really transparent about that. As you can see here, we provide information on where the route data is coming from and links to those maps. We also provide PDF maps on each pipeline page, especially when spatial data isn't available. And all of this can be exported, so if you want to evaluate potential environmental impacts or conduct your own environmental justice analysis, you can do that by exporting our pipelines data. So just to summarize, Oil and Gas Watch is a website that tracks new and expanding oil, gas, and petrochemical projects. It's a mapping service that provides access to hundreds of digitized pipeline routes, and it's a permitting database, as well as a news service, which aims to communicate often technical and coarse, dry data to a layman audience, and to communicate the real impact of the build-out through human interest stories. So if you're someone who's affected by the pipeline build-out, we would love to hear from you. Again, my name is Alexandra. I've provided links to both of the websites here, and I've also put out a few pamphlets on most of the tables if you want to learn more. Thank you.
Wonderful job, everybody. Really informative presentations. A little bit of housekeeping. Haley, would you mind running mics during the Q&A? Thank you. Oops, forgot my questions down here. So we're going to move into questions for the panelists in a moderated discussion. My first question for you folks up here is, given the public's interest in easy access to relevant data and regulator interest in assessing the success of programs, pipeline data communication is a key tool in connecting with those stakeholders. What is the current state of pipeline data communication, and what are current challenges and opportunities?
Thanks for the question, Erin. I think as far as the current state of pipeline data, of speaking broadly to incident data, to location data, to investigation data, I think it's improving a lot. I think folks have an interest. From the trust's perspective, this role that I am in is new as of almost 2 years ago. And I think similarly, we've been seeing a lot of new roles or new focuses at PHMSA working on similar things. And we've been seeing partner organizations like the Environmental Integrity Project continue to expand their work in this space. So I think it's a really, it's motivating to be working in it, and it feels like, with the passing weeks, months, and years, we have more partners every year. It's going to get easier and easier to fill these panels with folks who are doing interesting work. I did forget the first part of your question, but I suppose I can pass it on.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you folks have an answer to this question? I can repeat it if you'd like.
Oh, sure. Well, I think the situation's improving. We're certainly trying to contribute to that by providing, for example, access to digitized pipeline routes. To our knowledge, it's the only website that does that for free. Paid services can be extremely expensive and inaccessible to community groups or frontline communities that are actively fighting these pipelines. So it's really important to kind of liberate that data and help folks visualize these issues.
Yeah, sorry, can you?
Is this? Switch. Yeah. There's a switch right on the top. Yeah.
Testing. It works. I think from PHMSA's perspective, like I mentioned, it's always been a priority of ours to make our data highly accessible. I think something we've really doubled down on wanting to improve and progress is our data visualization, how we make that data available. So we've been working a lot lately on developing preset tools that will help users of any experience level download the data and the data visualizations that will help them answer their own questions. So we'd really like to empower users to be able to ask questions and answer them using our tools. I think you asked about challenges and opportunities. I think one of the biggest opportunities right now is, like I mentioned, data science is constantly changing and evolving, and especially with the emergence of new machine learning and AI tools, we have so many additional powerful and robust ways of answering questions now that we didn't have a decade ago. And there are certain patterns that might not be evident to the human eye that will be evident to a computer. And I think that's hugely interesting and hugely promising. And in terms of challenges, I mean, this is a complex, as we all know, it's a very, very complex problem with so many moving parts, and there are both human and physical contributors to any accident that happens. And sort of separating out and sussing out those human factors and physical factors is complex, but it's also an opportunity, and AID has recently brought on someone with expertise in human systems, and I think that's going to really contribute something incredibly helpful to our understanding of the problem.
Thank you. My next question is, with an increased public and stakeholder focus on environmental justice and federal initiatives like Justice 40, the intersections of our social, built, and natural environments are more in focus than ever. How is your work considering environmental justice, and at what stage? Planning, development, communication, or something else?
Thank you again. As far as the work that we're doing at the Trust to consider environmental justice, I think that happens at every stage. With the state incident map, which I should have clarified earlier, that is very much still a work in progress. It was, I think, day one that we started working on that project involved talking about how we can we talked about the goal, and then directly following that is how can we make sure that we're considering communities that have been disproportionately affected by pipeline incidents and pipeline development. It's a complex question to answer. I know that there are a lot of projects working on developing an index, whether it's things like EJ Screen or, it feels like every federal agency has its own environmental justice index at this point. We at the Trust, we're not tied to any specific one. We want to make sure that rather than having an index or any sort of specific tool, that we're considering communities as a whole and as their distinct characteristics that make them an environmental justice community. So it's breaking it down into specific variables and also looking at aggregated data as well, so that we get every perspective that we can. It really is such an important piece of this puzzle, is especially looking at the incidents, the developments, is understanding what has happened, and the next step is what can we do. I think there's a lot of exciting work. What Meg has talked about as far as being predictive or proactive rather than reactive. I feel like looking at the incident data, it always feels like we're being reactive, but step one and even getting back to that proactive piece is understanding what has happened and contextualizing all of that. Cool.
Thank you. As I mentioned, we provide information on environmental justice indicators on our website. However, we do that for our stationary sources and not for pipelines. I think the most valuable data product we produce are these digitized pipeline routes. I think it's really important to make that data accessible, and anyone has access to it and can perform their own environmental justice analysis. I think this is especially critical for pipelines that have not yet been built. It's really important for folks to know, where proposed pipeline routes are going to be cited. It's important for them, not just from an environmental perspective, but also to engage folks in the public participation process. So I think that's really valuable. We're also working on an analysis with carbon pipelines, so evaluating populations within 2 miles of proposed carbon pipeline routes, and that'll be ready next year. And we also spend a lot of time communicating data to a layman audience. So as I'm sure a lot of folks here know, federal dockets can be pretty dense. Permit documents can be really dense. They can be confusing. What we do is we identify the most important information and communicate that to a general audience. We also tried to highlight public interest stories and, as I mentioned in my presentation, kind of bring that data to life and make it more accessible by shining a spotlight on the real human impact of the build out. And so bringing it down to kind of a more general level and not such a technical, dry level. I think that really helps engage folks. Yeah.
As part of the Justice 40 initiative, PHMSA uses a underserved communities map, and that's more a question for my colleagues in the policy department. So if you have questions about that, I highly encourage you to seek one of them out and pick their brain. From my perspective, I'll just add that I think to have equity, we need objectivity. And I think that good, strong data analysis will contribute to that objectivity. And I think data-driven decision-making will contribute to that equity and objectivity. And I think that in any old field, there are always assumptions and narratives that go into the problem that are sometimes left unquestioned. And part of data science's role is to question those things that maybe have been assumed or unquestioned for a long time. And I think that's a really important first step in understanding the true picture before us.
Thank you. So the last question I have is, with various stakeholders from a diverse set of backgrounds and differing levels of existing knowledge, accessible data communication is critical to conveying knowledge and supporting collaboration. How do you accommodate the needs and perspectives of different stakeholders, such as regulators, affected communities, and environmental groups, and how do you turn that knowledge into empowerment?
Well, first I'll start by saying at PST, we're a lot of the graphs that I make, a lot of the products that I work on, the analyses that I develop go out to specific stakeholders. There are a few things that go out to everybody, but there are pieces that are going to just folks in government or folks in industry. And I think a key part of the development process for any of those pieces, for stuff that goes to the public, stuff that goes to regulators, whatever it is centering your audience and making sure you're communicating things effectively. So the pieces on our website that are fully public, we're trying to communicate to folks who don't necessarily have the background in pipeline incidents, in pipeline jargon, and pipeline terms of art, whatever you want to call it. We want to make sure that we're communicating things at the most accessible level possible, making sure that we're lowering barriers to understanding, lowering barriers to knowledge. I think as far as considering the feedback that we get, I'm always excited to hear from folks who work at PHMSA, who work in industry, and who are members of the public about what we could be doing better. That really goes for everything. That doesn't mean I'm going to do everything that you people tell me to do, but I am always thrilled when we get any type of feedback, because it means that people are looking at what we're doing, they're paying attention to what we're doing, and they're engaging with it to a point where they have something to say. And I think that is ultimately my goal, and the goal of the data projects we work on at the Trust, is giving people the knowledge they need to be able to say something about what we're communicating. So yeah, just to center the stakeholder and make sure, we're giving them the tools they need to have feedback, I think. Not just to me, but to pipelines and the broader discussion.
Thanks. I feel like I answered this question with my previous answer, but I guess I'll just add that we spend a huge focus of ours is to communicate data in a really accessible manner, or like our communications director says, in a way that even your grandmother would understand. So we do take a lot of time and effort to do that. We've talked a little bit about some of our data visualization tools. Another huge focus of ours is spotlighting public comment opportunities. So we really try to empower communities and the general public by distilling a lot of information at a national scale in a way that will allow folks to engage in the public participation process. And we really think that's critical. It's critical for frontline communities and communities living around these new pipelines, new facilities, or expansion projects to have a voice in that dialogue, and that is built in through our permitting process. So it's really important that folks engage, and we do everything that we can to help them do that and make it a little bit more accessible.
Yeah, I think the data visualizations are hugely important for reaching our audiences. If you throw a table in front of someone, it might take a great deal of effort and possibly prior knowledge of what they're looking at to know what to do with that table. Whereas a visualization, I really like what James said earlier about data telling a story. I think with the visualization, you can tell a story that has a beginning, a middle, and end, and implies what can be done. So I think that's a really big step for us in improving our data communication. And then I think to reach various stakeholders, we've been thinking a lot lately about scale and how depending on the stakeholder, they might be interested in a different scale of data. A member of the public might want to know what's happening on their street, and a state partner might want to know what's happening in their state, and maybe they want to compare that to national trends. So developing tools that would allow someone to pull data easily at whatever scale they're interested in, and pull data easily at multiple scales so that if you are a state partner and you want to compare to national trends, you're able to do that. And I think one example of something that we're excited about and have been working on, we fielded a question at a conference not too long ago about how we disseminate lessons that have been learned in the community. And it caused us to step back and reflect on what we are doing and are not yet doing to make sure that things that one operator or one group learns really are accessible, so not everyone has to learn it the hard way. So we've really been coming together and brainstorming all the different ways to make that information available so that we can prevent the same bad thing from happening more than once. And so we're talking about different visualizations, we're talking about how to create stories out of events or accidents that happen so that they're vivid and that the takeaway is clear, and hopefully that might prevent the need for that sort of event to be repeated in order for the lesson to be learned by the broader community.
Thank you, panelists. We're going to move to our audience Q&A. Haley has a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand high. And we really want to get members of the public asking questions too, so feel free.
If you could also please introduce yourself just so that we can be friends here and know who's asking the question.
Hi, my name is Kirk Jalbert. I am a professor at University of Buffalo. I've been studying public engagement and data practices related to the oil and gas industry for probably about 15 years. So a couple points. First of all, thank you so much to PHMSA for bringing in a lot of new fresh perspectives and expertise on data analytics and data communications. It is very much needed. I just want to say that PHMSA in general does a really good job of that compared to other agencies that I've studied, and so you definitely deserve some kudos. But I also think that we tend to fall into these patterns where groups like the Pipeline Safety Trust and EIP and Frac Tracker and go down the list end up having to fill in the gaps for a lot of the kinds of tools that you're talking about as these ideal goals that we'd like to reach as an agency. So I really just want to encourage PHMSA to keep moving in this direction and not assume that it should be the burden of nonprofits to figure out how to communicate wisely to the public, right? I do want to also just ask, Meg, you mentioned that like objectivity of data can be really important for trying to address some of the ways in which we don't attend to environmental justice questions, right? But I would also say that we need to attend to what kinds of data we're using and asking those questions and doing that analysis on what kinds of data do we not have that is perhaps masking some of those injustices. And so first question is, what kinds of data do you think that PHMSA needs that doesn't have presently to be able to deal with EJ-related questions? And then as a follow-up, I'm interested in knowing from the other panelists, what data would you love to have from PHMSA that you don't have presently?
That's a really great question and a admittedly a little bit of a complex question to answer on the cusp, and I will definitely keep thinking about the question of what data types we're most in need of. As part of the DAT team, which was that interdepartment team I'm on that I mentioned, we've been having a lot of conversations, first about feature engineering. So I am really passionate about natural language processing. And I think that a lot of information can be gleaned from text summaries, whether there are my division's full failure investigation reports, which are many, many pages, 30, 40 pages, or whether they're just the operator's summary of what happened. I think there are a lot of clues in those that dig a layer deeper than what might be reported in some of the numbers, especially when it comes to human factors. I think that when we look at a cause, it's important to say, okay, but what caused that cause? And okay, what caused that cause? And sometimes the deeper cause is hidden in what's reported on the surface. And I think it is our obligation to keep digging until we get at the true root cause. Because if the root cause is obscured, we're never going to be able to fix the problem. And I think we're never going to be able to address the questions of equity that you're asking about. So by using techniques like natural language processing, where we can ask a computer model to find similarities between 4 incidents that maybe I don't see any connection between, but maybe they all hurt similar communities, and we might find a similar root cause in some of those by digging a few layers deeper, is a way of engineering some of these features that we don't currently have. But I do also feel that, like I said, I'm fairly new, and so I'm still learning and still observing, but I do feel like I will be heard as a data analyst if I say, I think we'd be able to do a whole lot more if we had this or that. I feel very confident that if I took it up the chain, I would be heard and that would be taken seriously. And that is so empowering to feel like I'm not limited by what exists and that there really is a whole world out there that we can expand into if we just observe it and speak up. So I'm sorry that that's not a full question. If I think of more, I will definitely come find you. But I would also love to hear what they think we need to be doing to improve our data sets.
I'm going to touch on something that actually Alexandra brought up earlier, which is that, knowing where existing pipelines are, I understand that it's a security concern, or at least that's what we're told, but it seems like it would be a public good. And I think especially when it comes to addressing environmental justice concerns, that is the number one thing that I would like to have, because it feels like, an uphill battle doesn't begin to describe the challenge that it feels like to get to an objective perspective on environmental justice with the data that we have now. We can get close, we can conduct analysis that is speaking to a very specific scope within that broader context, but to have a full picture, it feels like that's the biggest piece that's missing. I do also want to touch on, part of what you said earlier is that, groups like the Environmental Integrity Project and PST are filling the gaps. But I feel like that's been well, I do want to kind of give PHMSA its credit. I feel like it's been well received. And I feel like, what we're doing, while it's filling a gap, it's also maybe, highlighting those gaps for PHMSA to pursue later. The conversations that I've had with folks like Meg have been very rewarding in that respect. So I hope it keeps trending in that direction for sure.
Yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse to death. Obviously, we'd love to see you guys liberate your pipeline data. I think it's also really important for proposed pipelines. One thing that's really frustrating to me is that companies often have to submit digitized routes to some government agency. But again, the process is really fragmented. So, it might be the Texas Railroad Commission, it might be LADNR, there are so many agencies involved, and depending on the scale of the pipeline, the product involved, you have a really fragmented regulatory framework, and that can be really challenging for NGOs and other stakeholders that are just trying to obtain information. This isn't necessarily criticism against PHMSA, but another thing we often deal with is confidential business information. So we will FOIA a document, and the agency will come back and say that it's blanked out. We get whole black pages of text just completely blanked out. So, why is a carbon injection well confidential? The location of that well, why is that confidential business information? Oftentimes it is the company telling the agency what to redact. We don't think that's in the best interest of the public and of public safety. So, breaking down those barriers would be great.
Sorry, I just thought of one more thing that came into my head as soon as I stopped talking. And that was, another piece that we would love to see is the incident data includes like the operator ID and the name. But a lot of these are kind of obfuscating. It's kind of getting around the point, and we don't immediately know the primary operator that's kind of responsible for the, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes the name is in the name itself. But sometimes it isn't, and that can be pretty challenging. We can get towards that data using some of the safety program data that PHMSA also puts out, but that speaks to some of that, fragmented process. And when we're talking to members of the media, members of the public, partner organizations, touching on that topic, it just makes it more difficult to get to the answers that folks want to see.
Got time for one more question.
I'm gonna do my best to get this out. My name is Lori Simmons. I work with PRPC. I live in far west Texas. I'm in social work, so I can really appreciate these data sets. That's what I use. I appreciate facts, hard facts of what's literally going on. However, we have decades of facts and studies and numbers and graphs and charts. At what point do we say we have enough data to know that this is a problem and that we need to address it instead of we're going to get more data? Okay? That can take years. We have people getting sick now. This is from sleeping in El Paso for a week because I don't live in these high contaminant areas. This is why I don't live in these high contaminant areas. I'm from Houston, and I actually had to leave because of this. So how much more data do we need from our government to look at before we realize there's a problem? And all of this data, nobody's talking solutions. I appreciate that we need to know the why and the how in the past in order to correct the future, but we're stuck in this how and why. We're not focused on the future. Nobody's talking about this is a problem, this is a correlation, and we need to apply it here. When are we going to get to that point? Yeah, there's a huge disconnect. I appreciate the work. I appreciate you getting all the information. I understand what that's like. I've been in research. I get it. That's a huge mountain you're pulling. But how much data do you need? I'm in social work. I'm sitting right here. I'm telling you, my communities, their communities are being affected. What do you need? You've got the numbers. You've got us. Can we all get to the table and talk about solutions today, not 10 years from now?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is a great question, and speaking back to the first question from our moderator, Erin, I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we face. Is we conduct these analyses. We're always looking at more data. People always want to get more granular, bigger scales, whatever it is. But turning that into action is probably the largest challenge that the three of us face, I would imagine. It's not something I necessarily know how to answer. I feel like the work that we're all doing, we're trying to answer specific questions, specific pieces of the puzzle. We're trying to piece that puzzle together as best we can. But the puzzle it has fragments, it has pieces missing, and those are things that folks like to point out when we're trying to get to solutions. It's like, hey, we're missing this. And it's like, well, I can't answer that question, but you have this. You should be able to move forward. I'm sorry, I don't have a very direct answer to what you're asking, but I can tell you that that is the biggest challenge that I think the three of us, I would imagine that we can agree on. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't represent government. I'm also very frustrated with our government at times. One thing, someone brought up filling a void. One thing we do is we actually sue the government for failing to protect the public and failing to live up to its mandate, which is to work in the public interest. It is extremely frustrating. We're often overworked and underfunded, and kudos to all of the people working on the ground who are dealing with these challenges every day, who are, I mean, that's why I could never do what you guys do, so just thank you so much.
And I don't have a lot to add, but thank you for your question, and your point is definitely heard. I am not in policy, and you're right that we're separate pools of people, but I do feel confident that the data analysis I do empowers the folks who do policy in my organization to have the ammunition they need to support the decisions they're making, and I do feel that you are most immune to pushback when you have the data to support what you believe is right, and I feel good about giving them that data.